Not gonna lie, but I'm a little confused. First we were in a recession, then it was canceled, then it never happened, now it's approaching. What's going on? Hey Internet, welcome back. My name is Tim, and today I wanted to talk about the economy, or rather the recession or the crash. It hasn't really been made clear to me anyway. If you stick around, at the end of the video, I'll tell you what I'm doing to personally handle this really confusing economic time. Before we begin, we should probably define a few terms. Now, formally, a recession is a widespread, prolonged downturn of economic activity, usually quantified by 2 or more successive quarters. But is that really what we're seeing, or does that really even matter? I mean, I can think of a few ways that makes this definition a bit flawed for what we're seeing. Significant downturn is kind of what we're feeling all around. I find a few ways that this definition could be abused and manipulated to really present any story that you would want to give the general public. Let's say I wanted to show the recession was over. All I'd have to do is show a single quarter of improvement, right? If the next quarter is bad, but the quarter after is good, it might not be quantified as a recession, even if all the downturn quarters are twice as large as the uptrends. Well, long term, we would still be in a downtrend, but they're not successive quarters. So would they call it a recession? I'm not so sure, depending on the source you want to use. If you just have 2 bad quarters, but they're only slightly bad, and you have a really good quarter that is 3, 4, or 5 times the amount of growth as it was in those 2 downturns, well, you might have prolonged growth. But with 2 successive quarters, you could call it a recession. Now, it uses the term significant in a lot of the definitions I've seen, but that's judgmental. What would you consider to be significant? Now, for me, significant economic downturn is quantified by high inflation, quantified by rising interest rates, quantified by an increase in unemployment. So, when somebody says the recession is over or never happened, I'm not so sure. Tell me in the comments what you think a significant economic downturn would be. Formally, an economic depression is simply a recession that is prolonged. Some definitions actually give a period of time of 3, 5, 10 years, while others give no period of time whatsoever. But they all seem to imply and claim that it is a worse version of a recession. But some sources I found just state that it's a substitute for recession, where after the Great Depression in 1929, using the term depression became such a taboo thing with the economy, but we still needed to describe an economic downturn. So recession was used in place of depression. Now, to me, it's really irrelevant which one you use, because both are significant, prolonged economic downturns, marked by many negative economic factors. The specific factors used for both vary from source to source, vary from who you want to talk to, what analytics you prefer. A few common points are unemployment, inflation, interest rates, and potential bubbles. That brings up another term we really should discuss, which are crashes. More specifically, independent market crashes. Crashes are usually caused by something that upsets the market in a great way. This could be an economic bubble popping. The big one of my lifetime was the housing bubble in 2006 to 2008. It caused the crash that lasted through 2012 to maybe 2016 is where some people consider the crash formally ended, where economic stability had returned to where it was pre-crash. Now, crashes are important to understand because they can oftentimes cause a recession. That is what a lot of people think is going on right now. The 2020 market crashes has caused a large upset in the economy, which is now affecting all of us. To me, the specifics don't really matter because they're all examples of economic downturn. An economic downturn, or a contraction in the economy as it's more formally stated, is just part of a natural economic cycle. Nothing can just increase forever, which is kind of what we're seeing. We've had such a large period of growth for so long, they call it the longest economic uptrend in recent history. A crash, an adjustment, a contraction, a recession, whatever you want to call it, was inevitable. It also will not last forever, but it will be temporarily painful. We should kind of recognize if we've already have started the true contraction, or if we're in the middle of it. It might not be too late to prepare. A few things I've been seeing recently that lead me to believe we are in or approaching an economic downturn. High inflation. Typically, the Fed tries to aim for a 2 to 3% inflation. We've been seeing as high as 8 recently, and a lot of media sources have been reporting 3% inflation, claiming we have it under control. But the real metrics the Fed uses show inflation is closer to 4 to 4.5%, which means it isn't quite under control yet, which leads to another problem: high interest rates. In order to help inflation, one of the big ways to combat it is to raise the interest rates. But this has an effect on the entire market by slowing the flow of money. Money's more expensive to borrow. Higher interest, higher pays on loans, higher pays on credit cards. It affects everything, from houses to cars to goods and services to the capital companies can borrow to grow their companies. As a result, the economy does slow down, but this cooling is part of the natural cycle, and it must happen in order to help lower inflation. The economy slowing can sometimes result in a recession by itself. One of those factors that really helps tip us into it is a shortage of certain goods. This starts panic buying, storing, saving that can further slow and halt the economy as a whole. Recently, I have noticed some items in stores are not available, or some brands I'm looking for just can't be found. This is that shortage of goods, which is why I believe we are currently in the beginning stages of a greater recession. Another common benchmark used is rising unemployment, which we've been seeing for quite some time now. A lot of people have seen vast changes in their jobs, in their employment, and how all of that works. And a lot of companies are reporting the inability to hire people, as in, people aren't applying. This lack of hiring people into skilled positions, into necessary jobs, is causing a rapid increase in pay of people who work there in order to help also pay outside people to come in and work lower skilled jobs. That causes the price of goods and services to continue to increase, which increases inflation, which increases the need to raise interest rates, which causes everything we've talked to up to this point to become worse. Which tells me again, we're at the beginning stages, if we're even in a recession, an economic contraction, or an economic downtrend. The last two major metrics I personally want to talk about: bubbles in markets and overvalued companies. Bubbles tend to occur when a certain good, asset, or company becomes significantly overvalued. Everyone tries to jump in and get out. Or it is overinflated and suddenly people realize it's not worth the value they've been paying. An example I used earlier is the 2006 to 2008 housing bubble. Housing prices had soared to ridiculous heights. All of a sudden, their value plummeted, which greatly affected the economy as a whole. It affected loans, which affected banks, which affected companies, which then affected employees, and the cycle spiraled out of control until the whole system collapsed on its own. This one bubble pop created a crash that resulted in the recession. What I'm seeing right now are three major bubbles. One is housing. Houses where I live are far too expensive. When you look at their assessed value versus what people have been paying or are charging for rent or charging to buy, it is out of control. And when looking in several major areas across the entire US, this trend is everywhere. It is offset based on the specific region you live in, and what was unaffordable for somebody in one place may be affordable for them in another. But locally compared values are just astronomical compared to where they were just a few years ago. The second big one I see is the car markets. Now, most people who deal with cars understand that used cars and new cars are outrageously expensive right now. Cars have become far more unaffordable, which is a huge problem to a lot of people who have to commute. Your car breaks down and you have to sink a significant amount of money into getting it fixed or getting it replaced. Another huge bubble is education. Colleges have spiraled out of control as far as costs. It's unaffordable to get a degree these days. And even if you do, you're gonna have a hard time paying that back right after you graduate. It takes some time to get a decent paying job. During the last few years, there's been a pause on student loans. That pause is not gonna last forever, and may not apply to new students going. The money always has to get paid back. And, as we talked about earlier, interest rates go up, the cost of loans goes up. It's not sustainable, and it will collapse fairly soon, in my opinion. The last area I wanted to talk about are stocks and the values of companies. Companies have been overvalued for quite some period of time. Now that things are overvalued, it becomes harder to invest. And all of the new investors coming in today are going to feel that burden as the value of companies are wiped out during a crash. Good companies will stick around, no matter what their stock price hits. If Amazon goes to 2 pennies tomorrow, they're not going to go out of business. They're too vital, they're too important. The same thing is with Apple and Google. They're too highly used. The value of a company is not directly tied to what their stock price is. But there are some companies that have become hollow shells. And until the stock value is wiped out, we're not going to fully see that effect. And a crash will make it very obvious which companies are good and which companies are bad. It's like a rising tide. When the tide comes in, all the boats are lifted. But when the tide goes out, you'll see who's anchored and who's going to get washed out to sea. The hard part is to say, we might not formally be in a recession, but we're definitely in some sort of economic downturn. The question becomes, when? How quickly will it tumble downwards? When's the recovery going to happen? Unfortunately, there is no good answer for any of this. Anyone who says they could accurately predict a recession is flat out lying, or are so full of themselves you probably shouldn't listen to them anyway. In my opinion, I think it's going to happen sooner than later. It could happen tomorrow, or it might not happen for another 5 years. How bad is it going to be? Well, personally, I think it's going to be pretty bad, just based on all of the contributing factors we're seeing right now. Stuck around this long, I'd like to tell you what I plan to do, or rather have been doing for quite some time now. Everything I'm going to tell you is nothing new. There's nothing magical to it. But it does need to be said because many people will talk about these things, but few people will actually do them. The most important is debt management. If you can manage the amount of debt you have, the amount of debt you incur, how much credit you're really relying on, that can go a long way to offering a good safety buffer. With that said, you have to be careful if you're in pretty high debt right now, because if the rug gets pulled soon and your interest rates go up on your credit cards, you could be left hung out to dry. There's plenty of videos that talk about how to manage that. I would recommend reading The Total Money Makeover as a good source of information for how to manage debt and how to financially rebalance your life if you are in a problem or think you might be. Second big point that a lot of people talk about is an emergency savings fund. Everybody should have some cash cushion to fall back on when things happen. This cushion is exclusively for emergencies. A lot of groups will talk about building a cushion of 3 to 12 months. I recommend doubling it going into a recession. Because at worst, you do have some extra cash sitting around. However, when you need it, you can use it. And if a recession's going to last a few quarters to a few years, you're going to want that cushion. Something I'm doing is shifting my investments. When the rug is pulled, if I've made some poor choices, it's going to hurt a lot. I'm not a financial advisor, so I can't recommend anything in particular, but I'm choosing to put my money into stable dividend companies. Even if the value of stock drops, if the company is operating correctly, if they're a good valued company, they will weather the storm perfectly fine no matter what their stock is worth. How to analyze a company is a whole different set of skills and a video for another time. In short, look for what people call blue chip stocks. They're typically safer, they're typically more resilient, and they've usually been around for a while and have weathered a few of these rough seas. Now, an important part, and it doesn't seem like it for prepping for an economic downturn, is skill building. if something happens to your job, if something happens to your place of work, you'll have other skills to fall back on. You might not be able to get a job in the market you were working in, or in a similar company in your area. You might need to do something different. But to build skills takes time. You will not be good at something overnight. And when building skills, you need to do it effectively and efficiently. It can't just be wandering blindly in the dark. You don't want to build up a whole bunch of skills that you can't translate into a job or into a profession at some point. Now, with that said, there's exceptions to every rule. And if they are skills you like and you can do them in tandem with skills that'll pay, I highly recommend you learn as many skills as possible and you do it in effective, efficient ways. There are many resources on skill building. So maybe in another video I'll cover it, but for now I would just recommend looking on YouTube, on Rumble, and on Google for how to build effective skills. It would be a good first place to start. The final thing I'm doing is preparing for opportunity, things such as investments, housing, the auto market, but you're going to want some resources to do this with. You need to prepare for those opportunities. And some of the things I've mentioned on this list help prepare for those, whether that is a new profession, or buying a fixer-upper house and repairing it, or just investing in companies who went from overvalued to undervalued but are still good, stable companies. Now, there are a ton of opportunities, and I'm not telling you any specific ones that I think you should specifically invest in, or you should look and focus on, because it's going to be unique in every area, in every region, in every country. What I see as an opportunity, you might not see that as something you want to do, or something you can do, or something anyone should do. But the opportunities will be there. Crashes, economic contractions, downturns, recessions create more millionaires than any other time period. So now is the time to prepare for them. With all that said, I'm not a financial advisor. And quite frankly, you shouldn't take anyone's word on the internet. You should do your own research. Look at your own information. Make your own conclusions. Use this video as a starting point. If you gained something from this video, like my content, or just want to help out a newbie, hit that like button, smash that rumble, and subscribe for more. I'm Tim, and I'll see you next time.